Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this webinar series, Families Celebrating the Sacraments, From Formation to Transformation. Today's presentation, 13, Engagement or Exodus, is part one of a three-part series of webinars brought to you by the Strong Catholic Families National Partners, which is comprised of the National Catholic Educational Association, the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, and the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership. I'm Andrea Kopp, Assistant Director of Professional Development with NCEA, and I'm happy to be your moderator and your host today. Just a few housekeeping notes as we get started. Please note that your microphone connections have been muted. If you have questions or comments during today's presentation, please send those through the chat box that appears in your GoToWebinar control panel. To ask a question, use your mouse to click into the blank box area, type your question using your keyboard, and then click send. Our presenters will be on webcam today. If you would like to expand the viewing area at any time, just click and drag the borders of those boxes to make them larger or smaller. If the viewing area disappears, if you click on your GoToWebinar icon, they should pop right back up. The webinar presentation will last about an hour, and there will be questions and answers at the end. You can post your questions or comments for presenters at any time. And I'll also be live tweeting during our webinar today, so you can join that conversation using the hashtag NCEA webinars. And please tag NCEA Talk or any of our other partner organizations. Their names will be displayed on the slides. Immediately following the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a brief survey about your experience, and we thank you in advance for providing us with this valuable feedback. You will receive an email tomorrow with instructions on accessing this recorded webinar, the presentation materials, and your certificate of attendance. You can also download those files now during the webinar from the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. Let us begin, as we do all things, in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord of life, bless and sustain all families. Hold us close, keep us connected, and protect us from all evil. Give us with love and patience for one another. Help us reconcile that which divides us, and celebrate all that unites us as one family. Where you live and reign now and forever. We ask this through Christ our Lord, amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Amen. It's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter and our panelists, and I think Bob is going to come on screen. Welcome, Bob.
Welcome.
Thank you. Our main presenter is Bob McCarty. Bob's a pastoral trainer and consultant serving as a coordinator for the St. Mary's Press Research Project on disaffiliated young Catholics. He's going to share some aspects of his research today, and we'll follow with commentary from our panelists who will represent different areas of ministry, and they'll be reacting to Bob's comments as well as answering your questions. Our panelists that we have with us today are Tom East, Director for the Center of Ministry Development, Barbara McGraw-Edmondson, Chief Leadership and Program Officer with NCEA, Father Frank DiCiano, President of Paulist Evangelization Ministries, and Amy McEntee, Pastoral Associate for Youth Evangelization at St. Helen Catholic Church. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us today. Bob, you can go ahead and get us started whenever you're ready.
I am ready. Well, folks, first, welcome to the webinar, and I want to tell you how excited I am to be able to share this information that we've surfaced in our research project on Going, Gone, the dynamics of disaffiliation in young Catholics. I want to say at the outset, though, you can see my objectives on the PowerPoint. This presentation is a very short, focused snapshot of the project and the data. Within our constraints of a webinar, I can only do a little bit here, but the design for this is to help set the stage for the webinars that will follow this. And so I think that's important to hear, that you're just getting a snapshot of the overall study. What I'd like to be able to highlight, though, are what are some of the common antecedents to disaffiliation? What are the things that we're finding in disaffiliation that leads to young people pulling away from the church? And at the end, we'd like to begin to identify pastoral implications, knowing that this data will need far more scrutiny and analysis by pastoral leaders so that we really do have a clear sense of what we're seeing in the stories of our young Catholics. And so to begin here, in order to make this a little bit more personal than just a webinar, I'm just going to ask you, if you would, in your mind's eye, I would just invite you to call to mind a young person or a young adult, somebody you know who maybe has disaffiliated from the church. It could be a relative. It could be somebody who's been in your programs in the past. It could be a family member. You know, it could be the sons and daughters of friends of yours. However you want to think about this, but just to make it real, just for a moment, just hold that person in your mind. Picture them. Say their name to yourself, and reflect on the factors, the experiences, what has contributed to their leaving the church. And I'll ask through the course of the webinar, just hold them in your mind and hold them in your prayer, so that what we share through this data is not just facts, but it's real stories. And so with that, what do we know about all this? To set the stage, I just want to remind us that the Catholic population in the United States grows every year, but it's an illusion because it's covering up the number of Catholics who are walking away. That the studies from a variety of sources are telling us that more people raised Catholic are leaving the faith than ever before. And so that's an important context for us in which to look at this. And the issue for us in ministry, the generation that's walking away is typically the generation from whom the church would be drawing its vocations, its lay ecclesial ministers, its lay leadership, and its financial support. And so I would propose that this issue is not just obviously a youth issue, this issue is a community issue. Other research bears this out. The Pew Foundation suggests that 22%, over 22% of the general population is unaffiliated. But look at the percents for millennials. Our young adult population, 36% of younger millennials, 34% of older millennials are religiously unaffiliated. The Public Religion Research Institute, they say this. They say that the Catholic Church has experienced the largest net loss due to switching. But those losses are offset oftentimes by the high percent of recently arrived immigrants who are Catholic. And so we need to put this in context, this issue for which we are discussing today. So why is this happening? And the key here is we need to remind ourselves at the outset, we are not discussing a youth or a young adult issue. This is not a youth or a young adult problem. This is a faith community problem. This is a faith community challenge. The faith community itself, we need to look at how is it that we pass on faith to following generations, and what is going wrong here that a large percent of our population, a large percent of our community is walking away. So having said that, here's the background. St. Mary's Press contracted with CARA. CARA is the Center for Applied Research on the Apostolate. In 2015, CARA did a quantitative study, a survey of self-identified former Catholic young adults nationally. And following that quantitative survey, CARA followed up by doing in-depth personal interviews over the phone with selected folks. We followed that up at St. Mary's Press with what's called a qualitative analysis. And what the qualitative analysis does, it takes the data and it takes the raw interviews. We worked with the transcripts of the interviews to find out what is underneath the story. We wanted to look beneath the data to the stories themselves of these young adults to see what we could learn about the church. One of the most fascinating, and I'm sure this is going to get a lot of public play, but one of the most fascinating pieces of data is when you ask these former Catholics, when did they stop identifying as Catholic? The median age is 13. So look at the breakdown here. Look at the breakdown between 13 and 17, almost 40%. It's by far the largest group is the high school age. But then the second highest group is middle school, which I think is pretty fascinating here. I would propose when you look at some of these ages under age 5 to 9, I think that in those sectors, I think we're probably seeing more of the influence of families who stopped identifying. But the numbers themselves, 11% in the 18 to 20, 3% 21 to 25, you can see that people are making very thoughtful, considerate decisions at increasingly younger ages. And that's why I think this issue is so important for us. To build a little bit, this is more of the quantitative data. We asked the question about which of the sacraments. Now, and look what happens here. Look at the drop-off between First Communion and First Eucharist and confirmation. Now, one of the things we don't know here, we don't know in which diocese these young adults were living, so we don't know what the age of confirmation typically is in those dioceses because we don't have a uniform policy across the United States. But even given that, you can see here that there's a significant drop-off between First Eucharist and confirmation. And I suspect that parish pastoral leaders know that. They have the stats in their parish. The second part that's very interesting here is when you ask them how often that they go to Mass when they were Catholic, you can see here it's very infrequent. The most is a few times a year or rarely or never. You can see as it goes down the list. But what it's saying to us is that one of the contributing factors here is an early lack of engagement and attachment to the faith community. And that's a piece that we'll need to come back and look at. There's a second part of this. Look at the levels of formation. If that previous slide talked about engagement and connection, this is about formation. So we're finding that even through Catholic schools, elementary schools, high schools, and universities, 2/3 have never had some kind of connection to our religious institutions, and likewise, many of them lack parish formation. 6 in 10, no involvement in parish or campus ministry of any kind. And so that issue around connection to the community, formation in the community, it's going to point to a pastoral implication here that we have families on the margin that we haven't been able somehow to engage in the life of the parish. To take it a step further here, what happens to those young people? This is where the data comes from that says 50% of those who walk away become nones or they become atheist or agnostic. When you add those numbers together, you get 49%. So you can see that roughly half of the people who walk away become nones, non-connected to a religious community. And you can see there where the other half is broken up. But what I'd want to call our attention to is the bottom right-hand slide. Look what's happening there. When you ask them, do any of these following people in your life identify as Catholic? Look at the percents for mother, father, and siblings. But look at the grandparents. I'm wondering if we need to reframe this and say perhaps grandparents are one of our more important resources for passing on faith. That maybe in a postmodern world, in a mobile society, maybe we need to be looking at that in a whole different way. So I think that's a pretty powerful statement. When you ask these young adults, so how do you see yourself now? So you can see the top left, neither spiritual nor religious seems to be the significant, but more spiritual than religious. We hear that a lot. I'm spiritual but not religious, so you can see that. Spiritual. And I think what's important about this slide is the whole bottom part of that pie chart, I think reflects a hunger for the holy. I think what we're seeing here is that there's still, and I believe that theologically, this is our understanding of soul. I think our soul, we are created in the image and likeness of God, and I think our soul, to use Augustine's phrase, and our souls are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. I think there's a hunger for the holy, and that's going to have implications for how we as a faith community respond pastorally to the disaffiliated. So we'll come back to that. But here's the first thing I'd like you to consider. When we were asking these disaffiliated young adults, why did they walk away? Here are 8 of the most popular reasons that show up in the survey. So I'm going to ask you just to take a moment, kind of quickly. This isn't going to threaten world peace. Just take those top 8, and which of those do you say are your top 3? When you look at these, what would be your top 3 guesses from your experience? And in terms of young people, young adults walking away from the church. So let me just give you a moment here to do that. I feel like I should be playing the theme song from Jeopardy here. We should be doing that in the background.
The audience is welcome to put their responses in the chat if they'd like.
Yeah, and then put your name and address so I can follow up. I'm just kidding. You don't have to do that. Okay, so you have it. All right, your top 3. Well, here's what's interesting about that. They're actually already in priority order. This is really interesting, and I think this is important. So what you're seeing here is you see those first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those first 6 responses make up about 78% of the responses. And so number 1 on that list, but look at the diversity of responses here. I do want to highlight just for a moment, just because for those of us who've been in pastoral ministry a long time, look how low the clergy sexual abuse crisis ranks. People oftentimes are surprised by that. They oftentimes believe that the clergy abuse crisis was a dominant factor in young adults walking away. My experience of youth and young adults in a postmodern world is that for this generation, their criteria for truth is experience. So if I don't experience it, then it's not real, it's not true. And I have a suspicion that unless they're in a parish, unless they know some family who's been affected by the sexual abuse crisis, this falls off the radar screen. And so I think that's an important piece for us. But embedded in those first 5 or 6 reasons, you're going to find the antecedents to disaffiliation, and you're going to find 3 of the primary dynamics that I would like to be able to highlight for us as we look through this. So when we ask these young adults, will you ever come back? They're pretty clear that they're not. That we need to be conscious in our pastoral ministry about that myth that says, here's what's going to happen. They're young adults, they're going to go off to college, they're going to get jobs, they're going to move, they're going to join the military, but when they get married, they'll come back. Or when they have children, they'll want them baptized in the church. That's not happening. These young adults are saying, no, they're not coming back. And in fact, one of the CARIS studies from last year said that only 39% of Catholics are being married in the church today. So those former ways of reverting, of coming back, I don't think that's operative anymore in any sizable way. So we need to take this seriously. So having said that then, in a qualitative analysis, rather than look at data, we want to look at stories. And I think that this is so central to good ministry anyway. In their words, listening to their stories. Invariably, when we would do these interviews, the young adult being interviewed would thank us. The young adult, him or herself, would say, I'm glad to tell my story. I had dinner with 3 young adults who struggle with their connection to the church. And when I said to them, here's what I'm doing. We are doing a study of young adults and their connection to church. And one of the young ladies, Rachel, said quite clearly, finally, someone is asking us for our story. I think there's a pastoral implication here about listening to the stories of our young adults. And so we identified 3 dynamics, and this is important for us to understand this. When we first started doing this, we thought we were going to try to identify these 3 profiles. And what we found is that there is no single profile. And in fact, there is no single dynamic. That when we read through the interviews, we found traces of the drifter, the dissenter, and the damaged. We found traces of them in all these different interviews. So to kind of break them up like this, just to give us a sense, here are the 3 dominant dynamics, but you'll find these oftentimes in all the disaffiliated. So the first one is about the drifter, characterized by a shallow engagement in the community. It goes back to some of the statistics we have. And here are 3 of the quotes from the interview that I think begin to highlight this. The first was about belief. I believe there could be a God. I don't know that there isn't one. Can't prove it in my, see that thing? I can't prove it, so I don't know if there is one or not. The second one, I drifted away. My parents stopped making me go. I'll come back to that force thing again. And I had no desire to keep on going. All right, so Diane kind of moved out of it. And all these are real people. We've changed all the names, obviously, to protect their identity. But these are exact quotes taken right out. We didn't even correct these quotes for grammar. I mean, these come right out of the interviews. Fran, I didn't particularly want to or not want to receive, and this was about confirmation. I just kind of went with it. I have a suspicion, we've heard that kind of stuff before. For those of us who've been involved in pastoral ministry, youth ministry, catechetical, or sacramental prep, I suspect that so far there's not a big surprise here. When we looked at the dissenters, characterized basically by more active resistance to church and faith. One of the implications here that strikes me is that oftentimes I have a feeling that our youth and young adults are more clear about what the church is against than what we're for. And so I have a suspicion that one of the unintended consequences in all of this, one of the implications, is that I think that we as pastoral leaders need to recommit in some way to emphasize here's what we're for, because that perception of church about rules and regulations, that this is what I have to obey, I think we're missing the joy of the gospel in here. This young person, Diane, she highlights one of the key issues that comes back over and over again. In the middle of her statement here, I am a complete supporter of gay marriage and be able to choose who you want to be with. If I had to name one issue that was common for disaffiliated young adults, it's their perception of the way that the Catholic community treats the lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender community. That issue came back over and over again in the interviews. I have a suspicion that is because we in youth and young adult ministry, I think we've done such a good job with social justice that young adults and youth are framing this issue as a social justice, as a human rights issue. That first principle of Catholic social teaching about human dignity, they see this as a human dignity issue, not a sexuality issue. And so this comes back over and over again. And then the second one, and I know there's been some press about this already, about the relationship between science and religion. And we found traces of that in the study. I was immersed in science. I studied, I believe, science more than a retold story. This was interesting, a retold story that's been distorted, mistranslated, contorted to people's beliefs. I just find the descending thing here, and you can trace a little bit of the anger in here, but that emphasis on science because it can be proven, which personally I find that pretty interesting because scientists are the first ones to tell you, there's always more that they don't know, but there we are. Remember, for our young people, for our young adults, perceived reality is reality. This is how they see the church. The third dynamic, the damaged or the injured. These are the folks, oftentimes the antecedents include family disruptions of some kind, negative church experiences of some kind. The very first quote here is about, it's the forced issue. I was forced. And after confirmation, I put my foot down, I did what I wanted, I was done with it. I bet we've heard that before. But the middle one, several times in reading the interviews, we'd come across a story like the middle one here, where people were dealing with some kind of a trauma in their family, in their friends, in their extended community, and they prayed. And the prayers didn't work. And the people died. And in a couple of the cases that I read, families divorced. It's that whole theology of prayer. And does prayer work? And so there's an implication here for how we present prayer. And I think some of these interviews, some of these quotes highlighted that. And then the third, it goes back to what this young person perceived as hypocrisy in the faith community and how this Catholic community dealt with the LGBT community. And so you start to see here some of these negative experiences that cloud our youth or our young adults and their relationship with the church. To move that a little further then, here are those 6 antecedents or common denominators that we found. The first, there's some kind of a precipitating event or a series of events that triggers questions. One of the pastoral implications, can we provide the safe community, the safe environment? Can we provide permission where middle school, high school, and young adults, they can ask the hard questions? The second is more of a cultural antecedent, that this whole rationale really does reflect the increased secularization in terms of the search for meaning and purpose. That what youth and young adults are finding is that religion is one option among other options for creating a sense of meaning and purpose in my life. The third, it was kind of disheartening, but sometimes the people in the interviews, they actually had a sense of being free or relieved once they made the decision to disaffiliate. which points towards the pain that they were probably experiencing as members of the community, even if they were on the fringe or the margins. And what a sadness, but they felt free of that. The fourth, they believe this is the forced issue. They believe it was forced on them, and now this is, what are the implications of this? They're determined not to force religion or religious practice on their children. So passing that down. So what does that mean for us in pastoral ministry? I think that's a question we have to explore here. The fifth one, this is really, it comes right out of Peter Berger, the sociologist. Increasingly, these youth and young adults, they see themselves as moral. They see themselves as committed to living a moral life. It's this quote, I can be ethical without religion. I can be moral without religion. I can be a good person without religion. And then the sixth one, there's still that hunger for something else. Whether they somewhat believe or disbelieve, there's something bigger here. They're not closed off to that. But here's the phrase that kept showing up. If a rational argument, provable evidence could be presented. I don't know what that looks like in terms of the gospel. Although I think Pope Francis gives us a pretty good clue when he says that the joy of the minister is probably the best advertisement for the gospel. I mean, that's not an exact quote, but that's what he probably would have said if he had asked me about it. Well, there we are. So anyway, we get that whole idea that there's an openness here. Okay, so here are 5 preliminary considerations for us. This idea of personal autonomy and choice, that's going to be an issue for us. If people are going to remain religious, that 50% that stay involved, they're going to look around for something. It could be the new atheism that seems to be highlighted in literature, evangelical Christianity, we could talk about that a bit, or science, but they're looking for something. The third, there's no significant way that they're coming back. That some will come back because of the life cycle, that's at 10 to 13% of reverts, but we need to pay attention here. More than just Band-Aid, we need to look at symptoms and causes. We need to, earlier on in our pastoral ministry, embrace this as a mindset. Church scandals are not as important as what we assume, but that 5th bullet point there, the very concept of faith has become more and more challenging. We are going to be challenged in pastoral ministry. Why is faith important? You know, I believe for a long time in my work in youth ministry that we had to know our answer to 3 questions. Why am I Catholic? Why do I go to Mass on Sunday? What difference does Jesus make? We might have to add a 4th one that says, what difference does faith make? And can we clearly state, here's why faith is important? Are we going to be able to do that? So having said that, I would like to close with this kind of a comment. Rather than see this as a problem to be solved, I think we need to look at this whole disaffiliation and say, what are we being told by the Spirit? What is the grace that the disaffiliated are bestowing on the church? I would encourage pastoral staffs, pastoral teams to have this conversation. To think of the disaffiliated as a mirror. Their stories are a mirror to us. Their stories are reflecting back to us their lived experiences. And what's the Holy Spirit telling us through the stories of those who've disaffiliated? I think these are critical questions for us to reflect on theologically and ministerially. And so, having said that, do we know who they are? Do we know their name? The ones that you've been holding in your mind and in your heart for this webinar. Do we miss them now that they're gone? And probably most importantly, do they know they're missed now that they're gone? Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to invite each of our panelists to activate their webcams at this time and take just a moment to introduce themselves, identify their area of ministry, and give some initial reactions to Bob's presentation. Let's just go in order of the photos the way they are on this slide and start with you, Tom.
Okay. I'm Tom East, Director of the Center for Ministry Development. Most of my work as part of a team is providing training for leaders in youth and family ministry, as well as resources and research and mission trips for young people in the summer.
I'm Barbara Edmondson. I am the Chief Leadership and Program Officer at NCEA, and our real work centers on working with Catholic schools and ministries throughout the nation in the areas of program and leadership development.
Father Frank?
Oh, me, I'm sorry. I'm Father Frank DiCiano with Paulus Evangelization Ministries, and we try to create those tools and opportunities to help parishes reach the unreached. And Bob has given a great description of the many people who are being unreached.
And I'm Amy McEntee, and I'm a pastoral associate for youth evangelization at a parish. And my area of responsibilities are from cradle to college plus. So that whole life cycle of families, right, that whole life cycle of families and being involved there. And previously worked at a diocese in evangelization and catechesis and nationally with young adult ministry.
And did any of our panelists have any initial just sort of reactions to hearing Bob's data and research?
Yeah, yes.
Go ahead, Tom.
I mean, I think the research is an important moment for the church. I was really pleased with this notion of looking at the grace that is there, because really, as Bob framed this in the beginning, this isn't a youth ministry problem, this isn't an adolescent problem, this isn't a young people problem, this isn't a generational problem. This is a holding up a mirror to the church to say, what do we need to do to follow the Spirit and to live our mission in the world? Because if we're failing to communicate the vibrancy and the fire of faith that's there to young people and their families, then we're failing. How can we see how to succeed at that?
Yeah, and I have written down on my sheet here, ethnic neighborhood, suburban choice, that we still have in our heads a church as it was in the 40s and the 50s when we lived in cities and all the Irish went to St. Patrick's and the Italians to St. Anthony's. But really, since 1960, we have been moving away from those urban realities where there was very little sense of choice and preference into suburban realities where you could choose everything you want. And so we haven't positioned ourselves as a church that people want to choose. We sit here and say, how come they're not coming, rather than why are they not choosing?
I was struck with the data that was presented by Bob, because I think in our ministries we surround ourselves by people who are the active faithful, and we sometimes forget about how many other people there are that our communities really have not embraced. And I think Father is correct when he says, rather than saying, why aren't they coming, what is it that we need to do differently to welcome them, or welcome them back in this case?
I would just add to that I think that the notion of how do we embrace story is so important and so connected to the gospel and how Jesus engaged with people and hearing stories and hearing those experiences and using that as a starting point to move forward, because there is this, as reflected in some of this research, there's this understanding that if the church is supposed to teach me what's good and bad, well, I have a lot of options for how to figure that out. So I think part of the question in here is, well, what's the purpose of church and of faith, and how does it tie into my life? And to give that answer really depends on, well, what's your life about? And so I really love that connection to stories, and that this is based in listening to those real experiences.
And Amy, that leads very well into our first kind of question for discussion here. Is a sense of belonging to a faith community important for young people? We hear a lot about the need for accompaniment when we talk our ministry speak, but what does accompaniment look like in a faith community, and how does that align with membership in a faith community? Barbara, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I was thinking as Bob was speaking, and he was saying how grateful the young people were to have someone to listen to them, to hear their story, as Amy was saying. And I mean, I think it can be as simple as that, listening to someone's story, not trying to debate or argue, that is their experience, And how can you, just by your presence and your understanding and your warmth and your model of joy in your relationship with the Lord, welcome someone back in without really saying, we're going to do this so you come back to the church. It's more, I want to be with you, I want to hear your experience, and I want to share my experience.
Anyone else?
Yeah, sure. As I was looking at that question, part of what struck me was thinking back to the original church. So the disciples who experienced Jesus' death and resurrection and him giving them the Great Commission, and just think about where they were. They weren't saying, what will I do on a Sunday morning? They were longing for this Savior that changed their life. They turned their lives around. They dropped everything to follow this man who they learned was God. And then he was crucified, and then he rose, and he was with them, but then he left, and he gave them this overwhelming mission. So coming together as a faith community was the thing that made the most sense in the world to do, because they would be gathering around and be back in touch with that encounter. Like, where will I go to experience what I experienced when I was with him? I can go around the table, I can experience Eucharist, and then I can continue his mission. So I think getting back to that energy, that when we talk about accompaniment, what precedes accompaniment, I think, is encounter. How is it that we're making sure that young people experience and encounter? As Bob said, experience is the validator of truth, a validator for faith for our young people. So how are they having an experience of faith that's not a secondhand experience, but having experience themselves? And how do we rethink what membership means? For too long, when we think about membership and youth, we're thinking about them joining a group that's part of the faith community. And I think what we're really focusing on, we ought to be focusing on, is how does the whole faith community embrace its young members? And how do we look at all those points of potential for accompaniment, like not creating necessarily new accompaniment relationships, but the people who are already accompanying youth, how do we build the capacity for each of those accompanying relationships to share faith and become an echo of faith? I think we need to really reorientate what we think about as youth ministry, to be thinking about young people in the congregation and thinking about young people being accompanied by a whole community. I heard from a young person once that they'd also like to feel indispensable. I said, what would you like from your parish? And they said, I'd like to know that someone would notice I wasn't there. So I think that's about relationship, and that's also about actively engaging them in mission. They've got energy and gifts to throw at something, and how do we offer them, as St. John Paul II says, the adventure of living out the gospel? How do we offer that as something that's an answer to their adolescence? I think the belonging, the membership, the accompaniment, the encounter, it all weaves together with that.
I would just add to that the model of church that we are presenting to young people, and quite frankly to older people, has to be less of a club and more part of who we are as Eucharistic community. And that's what we're baptized into, and that's what we share in with the Eucharist, is this is not a club that happens to have Eucharist, but we are Eucharist, and we are community together. And I have said to some young people that when you are baptized in the faith, how I feel about you is irrelevant. Because I still am connected to you through baptism and through Eucharist. And so there's something that is stronger to being engaged in a faith community, to being part of a Eucharistic community that is beyond clubs. Because if it's just a model that is a club that they can choose to join or not join, they have better options.
The data in some way are a representation of the whole problem of belonging in modern society. People belong very differently today than they did 50, 60 years ago. There's so much optionality about it. There's so much tangential, I'm there, I'm not there, how does it fit into my life, etc. And it's a problem on both sides. How young people feel they can belong to a church, but how a church feels that the young people belong to them. And we get into the little bubbles and who's coming to church and what the collection was and whether we need a new organ and all these kinds of things without thinking about the fundamentally relational reality that parishes have to be and how young people are included in that relationality. Because everything that Bob talked about is really a failure of relationship.
We had a lot of comments in the chat related to sort of sacramental prep, And even in Bob's presentation, that's kind of sentiment. Well, I did this kind of because I felt like I had to, or my parents wanted me to, or it was expected. How can we assist parents in clearly stating why they want their children connected to the church? Can parents clearly articulate why their own faith is important to them? Father Frank, why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, I think one of the major problems we have as a Catholic Church is we invest very heavily in catechesis and in sacrament. And both of those things are formidable. I mean, been around for 2,000 years. But they presume, in modern society, they presume an encounter and an experience that is not necessarily there. And so Catholics have the sense of jumping through the hoops or going through the motions or doing this or doing that, but they don't have the experience of actually encountered Christ and making a commitment to him. At least they don't have an explicit experience of that. I think that there's a lot of church going on in the lives of non-church people, and we have not helped them identify the vectors of faith, of transcendence, of hope, of love that are going on in their very family lives. What does it mean for a parent to bring a child to the church? What is that parent hoping for that child? What is the parent looking for? And in some sense, every parent who in any way relates to the church is looking for the fullness of life and love for their child. And that's transcendence, that's God. And so we have to give people a kind of a God vocabulary that's not just linked to sacrament, not just linked to catechesis, but mostly linked to their everyday life.
I'd like to add to that a little bit. When I talk to ministry leaders and catechists about families, a lot of times there's a lot of negativity about that, and it comes down to two major responses. You know, if only those families were doing the job they should be doing at home, and then secondly, if only those families would be supporting us in what we're doing. And I think both of those almost presume that families are sitting there thinking, how can I thwart Tom and mess up his ministry program by not doing these things and not supporting him? And I think it begs the big question, which I think really, you know, was posed to us in the new evangelization. The question isn't how do we get families to do a better job that they should be doing. The question is how do we inspire and evangelize families? So the questions we're asking about young people, those are really questions we're asking about the families too. How do we deal with drifting, dissenting, and injured families? How are we inspiring families with encounter and accompaniment? How are we helping families to feel essential to the community? Once we do those things, and once we redefine our ministries to see that it's about the whole family and not just about getting mom or dad to do a job better, let's send a few things by email so they'll do those things at home. Like, it's changing our framework. And having families feel like we're on their side is probably the biggest step we can take.
And there's a question.
And messy families.
Yes.
There's a question that came through the chat that I wanted Barbara to comment on because it's related to what you just said, Tom, and what Father Frank chimed in on in regard to families, the needs of families, and the sacramental question. Sort of the demands, the way the question is framed is the families feel overwhelmed when it comes to sacramental prep, particularly confirmation, because of what they have so many things that are required in school. That's why I wanted you to address this, Barbara, with your Catholic schools background, plus the requirements of the parish and all the schedules and trying to please everyone. How can we accompany those families better in balancing all of those and sort of fostering that culture of encounter? And how can schools particularly play a role in that?
Yeah, that's a big question for sure, because we have the big parish school question here in terms of how the school thinks it might be, how the parish thinks it might be. I think you're right, Andrea. When we have that sacramental prep, or even when it's not even a sacrament, when it's just children attending church or children being part of a youth group or whatever that might be, is that there are so many other things that are competing in the family, especially families that have multiple children, especially parents. And, you know, in most households today, both parents are working, and there's just a number of commitments. And so I think often we, you know, our ministries create programs for parents that they say, this is what we do to complete this program, and then you'll be prepared for confirmation. It never really starts with a discussion about what the dreams, as you were saying, Father, are for their children, why they want confirmation for their children, have they talked to their children about confirmation and what it means. So I think that, you know, and this goes to what Tom was saying as well, if we could start with that, about the desire of the parents, of the children, and create that sort of burning desire for it, those things where I have to go to this class or I have to have this retreat or whatever don't become have-tos anymore. They become want-tos. And so if we start with, you know, why this is important and why we welcome these young people into this rite of initiation, then we have a desire to do it, not that we have to jump through the hoops and then check the boxes and now I can go to confirmation. So that's sort of a roundabout answer to it, but I truly believe it relates to what we're all saying. It's about how do we create a desire because of the relationship that we know that people long for something greater, something bigger than themselves, but really don't know how to articulate. How do we begin that conversation so that they begin to feel those things that will create that desire in them to go through whatever it is their church has asked them to do to prepare for the sacraments. I recently went to my own son's confirmation class, and I was sad to hear, and believe me, I'm not talking about, oh, we're doing everything right in the Evanson family, because we're certainly not, but the pastor introduced himself to the families, and I thought, if these families don't know who this pastor is, we have a bigger problem than we think. Truthfully, this is just, oh, my child's a freshman in high school. It's time for them to go to a confirmation class. So truthfully, I would have loved to see us start in a different way, but we did go through all the requirements for the classes, I think are most people's experiences. Schools, I don't know the answer to that with schools, because right now, schools and churches, for the most part, especially with these young people who many times are off in high school, they're not working together around sacramental preparation. There's school and there's church. They're not one, because our high schools are not, for the most part, connected to parishes, and so there isn't that symmetry like there once was when it was the parish school, and then there, you know, and then preparation. They used to be one and the same.
Yes, but as the oldest person on this panel, I think I remember when we graduated grade school, all the lectures they were giving us to make sure that when we got to high school, we continued going to Mass. And I would bet half of our graduating class did not continue going to Mass. And this was back in the golden days of the Baltimore Catechism. So there's always been this kind of question of how you continue belonging when people have more options in life.
Yeah. I do think, Father, though, that our young people who have the opportunity to attend a Catholic high school, many of them do really love liturgy when they're there, because it really speaks to who they are. It's organized by young people. The music is their kind of music. I think they have a good experience maybe at the school, but it doesn't translate into parish life, unfortunately. It stops at the doors of the school.
Right, and Christian Smith made clear that kids go to Catholic high school because the parents are committed to the faith. And so you have that prior commitment of the parents who are willing to invest. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so much of this is the parents are tangential, and so the kids are as well.
Yeah. Well, and as Dr. Smith said as well, that like the parents who are committed to the faith who don't send their kids to Catholic schools have roughly the same results in terms of Catholic identity and practice as the ones who are sending them to the Catholic school. So I think, you know, this is reminding me, as Bob was talking about levels of affiliation and practice, you know, as a Catholic Church, as Monica Helwig said, we cast a great big net. So we have a lot of people who identify as Catholic. Other denominations have a little bit tighter definition of that. But if it goes back to what Bob was saying, like, how do we make what we're doing so compelling and attractive that people want to be with us? And how do we make that around mission, around relationship, so that there's an energy and dynamism, and we're moving from a have-to world to a want-to world. And I think the worst thing we could do would be to take an attitude towards sacraments that somehow, like, well, these people won't get it until they're worthy. Of course, if we didn't get sacraments until we're worthy, then none of us would receive them, right? So there's a little bit, I hear a little bit of arrogance sometimes amongst us catechists, towards the sacraments. I think some way to help people see it as something beautiful that we are stewards of. And how can we rejoice when a couple comes in and says, I want to baptize my child? How do we change the way we treat them?
One thing I wanted to say is the kind of data that we have, and generally these surveys, inadvertently bring in our heads a kind of an us, them, in, out, who's connected, who's not connected. And I think some of that can really be distortionary. The picture that I like is that there's a color, let's say it's red, and there's an intensity of the color in the middle, and those are people who are consciously, actively able to do all the things that church-going people do. But then there are lighter shades of that color, and they go out and out and out. And so we don't say, well, they're in this category or they're in that category, and so therefore they're over there. Nobody is over there. We're all connected in this Catholic family. It's just much bigger than who goes to church on Sunday and who goes every Sunday. And I think that that's kind of an opening of our minds and new evangelization, and certainly the idea of accompaniment going out into the margins. These have been the notes that the popes have been trying to give us for the last 20 years.
There was a really interesting question that came through the chat, and I know I'm throwing you off because I'm going completely out of the order where we practiced all of this, but there's some really good comments coming in through the chat. Someone had said, how do you teach a young person about God when they have never had a need for him? That phraseology was interesting. The idea, we talked about fostering that culture of encounter. Any reactions to that?
Oh, I'll take the bait. When they've never had a need for God, or when they've never realized that they have a need for God. The idea that 13-year-olds have decided that they are atheists is on its face absurd. I mean, what do you know about God when you're 13 years old to be able to say there isn't one, or I don't need him, et cetera, et cetera? So I think, again, the way we tend to package, if you'll pardon me, package Catholicism sometimes obscures the theological reality that is in the lives of people. And it is only through broader fields of dialogue and connection, broader fields of accompaniment, that we can give people permission to get in touch with the theological reality that is inside their lives. I mean, certainly secular culture gives the impression, oh, we don't need God, we can solve this, let's put money into this project, et cetera, et cetera. But everybody experiences brokenness. Everybody experiences a desire to be more fully connected. Everybody wonders, what does it mean even to exist? And these are questions that, Thomas Aquinas uses these kinds of questions to demonstrate the reality of God. And so we have to get into an experiential way of helping people get to our theological content.
I think that sometimes the rejection of God is rejection of a really narrow image or concept of what does it mean to be God, or who is God. And so if I have a young person who said to me, well, I don't need God, I think my first response might be, do you need love? Because God is love. And so when we can go to some of those basics and then broaden a little bit, can we make God big enough? And the reality is that God is big enough, but can we give an image of God and an understanding of what it means to be God that can break through that box of, this is why I don't need God, because God only fits in this box. This is the image I've been given of God, and I don't understand how that works. And so I think part of that conversation has to be, what's your image of God, and what is it about God that you're rejecting, and then starting with that very basic message of God is love. God is perfect love. And we all have a need for that, and we look for it in a million wrong ways. But can we help young people to experience the love of God, and then the theology and the things that follow from that?
Mhm. I think part of the question that's being raised is for someone who's very comfortable and maybe hasn't reached a point of crisis where there's an overt need for God, then how is it we reach them? And I also think that the need for God is kind of in direct relationship to our experience of God. If we've experienced God, then we know we need God. It reminds me, Father Ron Rolheiser was quoting one of the Canadian bishops about this drift and change in Catholicism. He said we knew how to be Catholic when we were immigrant, when we were discriminated against, when we were poor, when we needed to be Catholic together. Do we know how to be Catholic now that we've arrived financially and from a power status and educationally and all those other things? I think it raises some good questions, but it goes back to this sense of how are we giving an experience of God, and also how are we making connections to what youth are experiencing. 1 in 4 young people has a diagnosable anxiety disorder, is the latest statistic I've seen. How do we provide an experience of faith and spirituality as a direct response to the anxiety that is so heightened amongst our young people and our young adults?
I wanted to say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Father.
Yeah, this thing about how difficult it would be to draw people back because they've kind of written us off and they said they'll never think about coming back. Well, the whole idea that they're away and there's a back to come to is the wrong way to put the question. They were never there in the first place to think about coming back. Nevertheless, we as a church need to figure out how to become this dynamic, attractive community of love and never give up on the idea that we can draw people and continue to invite them and continue to involve them. I think that would be an acceptance of defeat and also a rejection of the whole idea of what it means to have the gospel and bring it to others.
And that is exactly, the question leads into the question I was going to pose based on, Bob's description of those categories of disaffiliation, the drifters, the dissenters, and the injured. How do we prioritize those families who are on the margins?
Well, I think we begin with the ones that are right by us and then communicate through them to the ones that are a little further away and the ones that are a little further away. Right on the edge of our parishes, all these categories are there, and people are going to shift from one category to another category depending on a whole variety of things. And one of the factors in their decision making, do they have any connection with us? Do they have any connection with parish, with community, with faith, with sacrament? And so the more that we can create parishes that make life accessible for people who don't conveniently fit into our boxes, I think the more we can create relationships that have the potential of involving people.
Okay, so we're getting close to our hour here. So I want to, conclude in a timely way, and I want to thank our audience for all of their active participation in the chat. They shared a lot of questions and a lot of just comments and affirmations of the things that you were saying. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to contact Bob. His contact information is on the screen, or will be shortly. And if you've not already done so and you want to download anything from the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel, please do that. If for some reason you're having trouble downloading it, don't worry, it's coming to you via email as well. I wanted to just invite our panelists to share any final comments. Tom, why don't you go first?
Sure. I think that this is a call to really make sure that what we're providing for people of all ages and families is is compelling, deeply relational, deeply energizing, and that we're really gathering people and sending them off in mission so that this matters. I think that's what we're talking about. How do we provide a faith that matters in their lives in 2017 and beyond? And I think that's the questions that Bob raises so well with us from this study.
And Barbara, any final thoughts?
Well, I think really Tom pulled it all together. It really is about making this relevant to the young people and to the families who are not members of our community right now. How can we create that desire for them to walk with us because we've walked with them? So I thank Bob for providing us with this information and for the opportunity to do some reflection on what we know to be our reality right now of not being able to reach those who we truly want to embrace.
Father?
Yeah, I'd like to retitle the document, not Going, Going, Gone, but Going, Going, ... Gone, ? Because I think God, faith, church, community, sacrament is always an open question for people, and we have to help them engage that question.
That'll be the next study, Father. Yeah,
Amy, any final thoughts?
So I think that one of the pieces that's involved here is, there's a lot of questions about how do we engage their stories and how do we do these things. And, Bob shared that slide that says, do you consider yourself to be? And 2/3 of them had some dimension of spirituality or religiosity in there. And I've heard that referred to as they're God-haunted. That there's something in them that is seeking for the divine. And I think one of the best things that we can do is to be mindful of our own witness. So David Kenneman from Barna posted a statistic a couple of weeks ago that said something like 84% of young non-Christians claims that they know a Christian, but only 15% of them see a difference in how they live their lives. And I think that how are we good neighbors? How do we live out our faith? How are those who don't want to affiliate with the church seeing what it means to be a churchy person? That's how we activate that sense of wonder and curiosity that allows people to reconsider what does it mean to have a relationship with God? What does it mean to be connected with the church? And so as we look at all these questions of engagement and religiosity, we also have to look at our own spirituality, our own faith life. Can we answer the question, what does it matter to be part of a faith community? Can we answer the question, what difference does it mean that I believe that Jesus is the Messiah? And how do we live that out in a way that is intriguing and engaging for other people?
Thank you, Amy. And finally, Bob, any final words before we conclude today?
Yes. So the one thing I want to say about this whole venture, this whole study, is that I don't think we know the answers yet, and I don't want to pretend that because we've published an executive summary that we have it all figured out. I think that the pastoral community needs to spend more time in serious reflection on these issues and carefully consider the implications, because if not, we might wind up responding to the wrong problem. And so we have to have these kind of fierce conversations across our church in order to delve more closely and more deeply into the stories of the disaffiliated before we start trying to say, here's the solution, because I don't think that's in sight yet. I think we need the conversation first.
Very good. Thank you all so much. And I want to thank Michael, who is in the background, the Wizard of Oz with me, answering all the Q&A, my partner in crime with all these webinars. Thanks for your support. And we have a couple of links in the chat box for you. The first of which is our the link to our next 2 of the 3-part series. This was part 1 of 3 for the Strong Catholic Family series. And then if you're interested to hear more in depth on Bob's research and study, NFCYM is hosting a webinar focused on that. So if you want to hear more about Going, Going, Gone, or Going, Going, Gone, ? You can register for that one as well. And if you're interested in webinars in general, please visit the ncea.org/webinars to see what other things we have coming up. I want to remind everyone that I will be sending you a copy of the slides, your certificate of attendance, and the registration link for the on-demand recording. You'll have all of that hopefully by the end of the day today, if not within 24 hours. And I want to thank you all for your time and wish you a blessed evening.
Thanks,
as well.
Andrea. Thanks,
Thank you.
Bob.
guys.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.